Whether you think there's too much regulation, too little regulation, or that the wrong things are being regulated, the fact is that regulations affect every day of our lives. Regulatory agencies make rules on everything from the shows and music we hear on the radio or on television to the materials that are in your mattresses. When we head to work or school, regulatory agencies have dictated safety features on the cars. They've created standards for highway and street signs. Almost everything we touch has been regulated in some way or another. But where do these regulatory agencies get their authority to create these regulations? As mentioned in your readings, what agencies do is defined by statute. Article 1, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution places all legislative authority in the Congress. Early in our country's history, it became clear that Congress needed to delegate some of this authority. They did not have the time to get into the detail of how a particular law was going to get carried out. They just didn't have time to do that. And so they began delegating this legislative authority through the act that establishes the agency. So they establish an agency, and within that act, give it certain powers. In your readings, this was referred to as the Organic Act. It can also be referred to as an authority statute or an enabling act or enabling statute. So, for example, in 1927, the Congress passed the Radio Act of 1927, and this created the Federal Radio Commission, and it gave it power to deny or grant broadcasting licenses and to assign frequencies to licensees and a whole bunch of other duties. Previous to 1927, radio was a new technology, and regulation of it was controlled by the Commerce Department. However, the Commerce Department had very little control over the radio industry. It was a new technology, and the Commerce Department just was not equipped to understand and be able to regulate this industry. In 1934, the Federal Radio Commission did become the Federal Communications Commission, and this particular agency, the FCC, was given even more powers and now not only regulates radio but also television, cable, and other mediums for broadcasting. Okay? This is an example, or this is a clip of Public Law 69-623, and in it you can see not only is it establishing, or it is establishing the Federal Radio Commission, but it's laying out some of the duties it expects that commission to do. And if you look at Section F, you also see some restrictions. So some things that the commission, the legislature doesn't want the commission to do. Okay? In addition to this Organic Act, as it was referred to in your readings, or if you want to call it an authority statute, there are statutes that charge a government agency with a specific duty. So it's not necessarily the act that created the agency, but it gives them a specific duty. So this is an example of that. So in 27 U.S.C. 215, the Secretary of the Treasury is given the charge of creating this labeling and determining the prominence of the government warning label. Okay? So not only, so authority statutes, when we talk about authority statutes, they are the statutes that created the agency, but they're also the statutes that direct the agency to do specific things. Okay? So, to get our terminology straight, an Organic Act, honestly, I'd never heard of this before the readings that we found for you. But again, this is the act that establishes the agency. The more common term, or the more common term that we use, is authority statute or authority act. So when we start referring to authority statute, this is what we're talking about. The statute that gives the agency the right to create regulations and to enforce certain things. Another terminology that is used is enabling statute. And you will see enabling statute or enabling act interchangeable with authority statute. And we will try not to do it, but we may do it and interchange those terms. But they mean the same thing. Okay, so what duties does the agency have? First of all, the agency has authority to create regulations. So kind of like the legislature, it makes laws, and regulations have the same power that of law that a statute does have. Okay? The agencies also enforce the laws. And finally, agencies have a judicial role. They hold hearings, they issue administrative decisions, just like a court would under normal circumstances, a civil court or a criminal court. Agencies have courts, or there's an administrative court set up that might hear items from multiple agencies. But we will talk about that further into the semester. But what I want to focus on now is federal statutes and regulations and how the steps compare, because we're going to be getting into the bulk of the class is going to be talking about the statutory process and the regulatory process. So I just want to kind of outline it for you here. So the first thing is bills or regulations get proposed. A bill, often a legislator, congressperson, will be approached by lobbyists, by someone in an industry. They might come up with some things on their own. They propose a bill. They write up a bill and they propose it. Regulations are similar. An agency evaluates the industry, might get a request from a specific industry to create a regulation. They might hear from activists of some sort or another, and they assess the situation and propose a regulation. The second step, the legislative process, when a bill gets proposed, it goes to a committee. There's hearings, there's discussion, there's markups. The committee goes through the whole process of sort of tearing apart the law, putting it back together, kind of seeing, how it's going to work. And then there's floor debates, there's a vote on it. If it passes one house, it gets sent over to the other house and considered, and ultimately it's sent to the president. With a regulation, you have what's called the notice and comment process, and we'll talk about this a lot in the coming weeks. So you have a notice of proposed rulemaking that's published in the Federal Register. And this is what you guys have in hand for your final project. This is what we're working off of, is this proposed rule. Then you have a period for commenting. This is when the public, in any entity that is affected by this regulation, is asked to submit comments. Sometimes the agencies, in addition, hold public hearings. And they take all of this information, and agencies have to consider all the comments that they get and consider any changes that they might need to make to the proposed rule. So, and it's a fairly lengthy process, but this is what they do, and so ultimately the proposed rule can either be modified based on the comments, or it can go ahead and get passed forward and turned into a final rule. Okay? Once a statute gets, or law gets signed by the president and becomes a public law, it gets published in the statutes at large first, which is where you find public laws in chronological order. And then ultimately, that statute, that public law, is taken apart and put into the United States Code and arranged by subject, so that it's easily findable. Okay? In a similar fashion, when a proposed rule becomes final, it's again published in the Federal Register, just like the proposed rule, and then ultimately it gets entered by subject into the Code of Federal Regulations. Step 4, really Congress doesn't have a step 4, but with agency regulations, there can be and often is congressional oversight. So Congress can always step in and hold hearings about a particular regulation. They often fund or defund particular actions by an agency, or they can pass legislation that, for all intents and purposes, overrules or bypasses a particular regulation. And finally, the final step is always judicial review. If a statute gets reviewed by the judiciary, the result is it's either upheld or it can be overturned if it's unconstitutional. With a regulation, different things can happen. It can be overturned because it's unconstitutional. It can be overturned because it's contrary to the statute, to the enabling statute or to the authority statute, or it can be overturned if the agency overstepped the bounds of its authority. So if it goes beyond the power granted by the enabling or the authority statute, then the rule can also be overturned. So there's a slightly different level of review for a regulation than for a statute. Okay? So that's just the summary for this week, give you an introduction, and now we'll be going on to statutes as we transition to the next module, and ultimately we'll be talking about regulations and trying to bring this whole thing together for you. Take care.